Yeah, so I'm actually from Texas. I'm from Austin, which is the starred area. And I now live in Dunedin, New Zealand, where I'm doing my PhD at the University of Otago in neuroscience. My thesis title is the role of neural synchrony in learning, memory, and decision making, and what kind of goes wrong with that in schizophrenia. But what I'm really here to talk to you about today is how the principle of neural synchrony offers a new way to diagnose and treat psychiatric conditions that stands to save the world several, ostensibly $100 billion a year. So this is where I live now, in Dunedin. I'm really, really happy to be there. This is my mentor, David Bilkey, on the bottom left. He's pretty much my intellectual hero, so it's an incredible opportunity to work with him. And the picture on the right is basically what we do. We walk around in the brain, we have conversations about what's really going on in it. So just to kind of give you a quick orientation of what's up with the brain, there's about over 100 billion neurons, or single units, single interacting pieces of it. And the connections between those are more numerous than the number of stars in the conceivable universe. So as you can imagine, this is not a simple problem. And use it or lose it will make sense in a bit. So what we're going to talk about today is what's kind of the problem that I think neurosynchrony is going to solve. What is synchrony? And then I'm going to ideally tell you how to start using it right now in your country to start saving hundreds of millions of dollars. So the problem is that psychiatric disease throughout the world, through direct costs and indirect costs, cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion a year. It's $563 billion in the US. It's $687 billion per year in Europe. And the types of costs are direct and indirect. So direct cost would be like, let's say you go to the doctor, and that actually costs you money to go talk to the doctor. Or you get a pharmaceutical prescription. So that costs society quite a bit of money. But what costs society even more from psychiatric illness is the indirect cost, the cost of not going to work, the cost of your caregivers not going to work. And as you can imagine, that cost is dramatically higher. So my particular expertise is in schizophrenia. I work with schizophrenics. People ask me what I think about and what I do. I usually just say I like to think about schizophrenia and hang out with schizophrenics. And so this right up here I'm showing you is kind of an idea of what it really looks like. Because most people don't understand that psychiatric conditions are a physical thing. It's not a soft kind of thing that you can talk out. True psychiatric conditions are physical. And so what you can really see on the top panel where it shows healthy controls, this is a human brain. This is data coming from our lab. And it's just basically showing you areas that are functioning during normal brain activity. And you can see in schizophrenics it's very, very different. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get across from here, is that they are very, very different. And we can see that. So this is, again, just to kind of put it in perspective. We're in Europe, so I figured I should talk a little bit about Europe. The direct and indirect costs of psychiatric conditions in Europe cost about 687.5 billion euros per year. So this is, that's a problem, and it's incredibly unsustainable. And the reason we have this incredible $687.5 billion deficit, or euro deficit in Europe, is in large part due to this. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders, or the DSM. And this is a handbook that psychiatrists have. Essentially what it is a list of all the different psychiatric conditions that you could possibly have, and little batteries of what we call symptom criteria. So there's usually 12, and in the opinion of the psychiatrist, so let's say me, for example, if I think you have 5 out of 12, you get the diagnosis, right? I mean, that's pretty crazy. in terms of how subjective something so costly really, really is, and why that's a problem. Another problem with the DSM is that, especially in the States, there's a huge incentive because of our insurance scheme to overdiagnose things. And so this citation, Broad and Cox, 2005, is basically demonstrating that almost 40% of practicing psychiatrists in the States are actively overdiagnosing on purpose. That way they get a higher insurance payout. So obviously this system, this way that we go about doing something isn't sustainable, and in light of the fraud, it seems to be just flat out immoral and wrong. So what I think is the solution to this problem is this idea of neurosynchrony, and it's what we work on in the lab. And so, I'm a neuroscientist, and one of the things why I do it is because I love it. It is my fun to a certain extent. And if there was one thing that I would want everyone to know about the brain, it's this, the Hebbian postulate. Cells that fire together, wire together. It's kind of a sing-song rhyme, but it is the fundamental way that your brain works. The whole idea of associative conditioning, for instance, of you ring a bell and you start salivating. The Pavlovian conditioning, that's really, really famous. So this diagram on the top is and the reason I'm doing this, I'm showing you this, is so that I just want you to have kind of an understanding of what synchrony is. That way, whenever we get to the part about how this affects the global community and whatnot, it'll really make more sense. So the diagram on the top is a diagram of Pavlovian synapse formation. This is actually how and why the dog salivates whenever you present it with the ringing of the bell. The reason being is that you see where it says bell and food, and they're acting on the salivation cell. So you have the bell cell on one hand, these neurons hanging out over here that are mediating the sound of the bell, and you have the cells that are mediating the experience of the meat and the salivation, cells that fire together, wire together, and we can electrically watch this connectivity happen. It's just like a circuit, just like you would flip a switch to turn on a light. So the reason that whenever you ring the bell, the dog salivates is because you formed a circuit, and now you're just passing current through a circuit that's existing. So cells that fire together, wire together, that's how it is that individual cells, and that's the fundamental way that your brain works. Now to zoom out a little bit, brain regions that fire together function together. And that, to a huge extent, describes what consciousness is. Consciousness is more than the sum of its parts. It is the interaction of the cerebral machinery. So the diagram on the bottom where it says open field coherence, this is data from our lab, just kind of showing you what synchrony actually looks like. And so the blue line is a healthy person. The red line is a schizophrenic. And so as you can see, there's a very, very kind of characteristic difference between the two. And we see this virtually across the board. And this is pretty nice because this is a physical way to describe a psychiatric condition rather than the subjective DSM-based one. So, just right off the bat, there's no opinion involved. It speaks for itself. It's very, very obvious. You can see it. So that's kind of an overview of what synchrony is. It's the index describing how much our brain regions firing and functioning together, and we're using the idea of synchrony to describe diseases as the breakdown of connectivity, the breakdown of synchrony between regions. So what I really want to do is, I was kind of hoping to tell this to policymakers and whatnot just to save their country quite a bit of money. But they should start using it because, all it actually takes is an EEG cap. It's not invasive. It's extremely safe. We do this on babies. That's a real experimental subject that's, undergoing a synchrony diagnostic procedure, which is, is pretty cool. So one of the interesting things about, I guess how we can use this is that virtually every major neuropsychiatric condition has a synchrony profile. So I'm talking, of course, schizophrenia, because that's my favorite. But epilepsy, autism, ADHD, bipolar, depression. We know what it looks like in terms of these synchrony indexes. And so what that really means is that we can stop using the DSM and we can start using synchrony. Now, a very important question to ask here would be, why hasn't this been done before? How much does it cost? Things like that. And the real answer for me is I don't really know, because to actually start doing this, to start using this, costs less than $2,000. All you need is an EEG machine, which most clinics already have, and you need someone who knows how to analyze the information coming from it. And that, for instance, I had no idea how to do that, and I learned how to do it in 2 days, and now I'm really, really good at it. And, if you just mandated like a week training, you could have like 13-year-olds doing this. It's really easy. So the only reason I can think that this hasn't kind of made it out of the basic science world is because, people hear about brain stuff and they just say, they think it's too complex. They don't see how it's going to be used. One of the other kind of interesting things that we could do using these synchrony indexes to change how we diagnose diseases would be, we have every patient's data being fed into a central database. So you can kind of imagine then that this graph over here, the blue line, imagine that's every healthy person who's ever gone through the diagnostic procedure. That's like an incredibly powerful statistic that's very, very sensitive to any differences, right? So it's going to become more accurate over time as we use this. And then all you're doing is you're just simply asking the question, is the person that we're analyzing significantly different from, let's say several 100,000 people who have already been through this? If yes, how? And then we have an incredibly more reliable way to diagnose these different conditions. So one of the other kind of goals I had here for policymakers was going to convince them to mandate the use of synchrony to validate treatment programs in your country. The reason being, and the reason I have an image of a bunch of money saved underneath the bed, would be that it's been shown that detecting these kind of conditions early will reduce your national healthcare expenditure somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%. And just to kind of put this in perspective, like with the seemingly silly numbers that I threw out earlier about the cost of psychiatric disease on society, it's over 3 times the cost of cancer. And no one disputes that we should be, rapidly detecting and finding solutions for that, because it's so much more widely understood and known. But this is a significantly bigger deal. It costs society 3 times more. People don't know nearly as much about it, and we can actually do something about it, which we can't really do something about cancer. So this is one of the other things that's kind of cool, is that we can use the idea of synchrony to validate a treatment approach. So let's say, for instance, that it takes on average 5 visits for a patient and a psychiatrist, to find the right treatment program, the thing that's actually working. So, and let's say that it's a month interval between each one, and basically the psychiatrist is just prescribing a different drug for each one. Rather than having 5 months of incurring these extra direct and indirect costs, we can do it in one, and we can use the idea of synchrony and the simple idea of any treatment that bridges the gap between abnormal breakdown of synchrony, which you can see just the difference between the red and blue lines. Like, again, that's one of the cool things about this idea, is that it's so easy to understand. And then after treatment, anything that brings the two together that's going to overlap the functional connectivity of these two brain areas is a way to validate what is the treatment paradigm that we're working on. And following up this idea of having a kind of a global network of patient data being fed into and kind of self-improving this all the time, we could actually automate, or partially automate, because we shouldn't take out the human element, but automate the diagnostic and treatment suggesting process, such that the longer we use this technology and the more that we use it, the more accurate and the more effective it becomes over time, which means that in the long run, it can start saving countries progressively more and more billions of dollars, which is kind of exciting. So the cool thing about Synchrony, since we have an objective physiological meter stick, is that we can start using all sorts of different kinds of treatment. It doesn't have to just be drugs anymore. We can validate different kinds of cognitive behavioral therapies, or we can do other kinds of stuff. Like, for instance, one of the things that I do is I build deep brain stimulators to basically ask the question of, well, if the brain disease is caused by activity being out of sync, can I just use direct electrical stimulation to resynchronize it? And the answer is yes. And in fact, we know that it doesn't matter how you do it, whether it's through talk therapy, whether it's through direct brain stimulation, or whether it's through drugs, the effect is always the same. A successful treatment always reestablishes and normalizes neural synchrony. So, Synchrony in the global community. The reason I came here and trying to tell you about this is because the more people that adopt this idea and the longer it's used, I've said this a few times, the better it becomes. So let's say, for instance, that in Germany, this program is adopted. It means that, even just within the country, people's ability to diagnose, treat, and kind of move forward on these psychiatric conditions becomes dramatically better. But let's say another country like Nicaragua, which probably doesn't have the resources to implement something like this, they will still benefit because of the advances in, say, Germany or the United States or New Zealand. Basically, what this kind of a program or this kind of a paradigm, what Synchrony allows us to do, is to have the benefits in one place instantly benefit everyone at the same time, which, as you can imagine, Benjamin Franklin would always say, "A penny saved is a penny earned," and this stands to be quite a few pennies indeed. So with kind of that as the lasting impression I want to put in your mind, hopefully you have an idea of what Synchrony is. You've seen an instance of what it looks like in terms of this is before treatment, this is after treatment. Using Synchrony is a valid way, an effective way, a cheap way to go about this. And you should also understand that it is, in my opinion, kind of inevitable that this kind of open source global collaboration against disease is the future. And so we're seeing this kind of a thing happen more and more and more. And I think Synchrony will be for brain-related public health what vaccinations have been for immunology. So thank you. I think it relates to the idea of cultural diplomacy in that it's a new way for nations to work together to build trust. And what I mean by that would be one nation that isn't normally thought of as kind of like maybe a big-time contributor towards maybe global well-being can be now. And more than that, it offers nations a way to work together in a way that's never been done before. One other kind of cool application of this, I didn't make a point of it, but maybe my academic side finds this intrinsically interesting, would be, let's say that people in China and people in Nicaragua are living two very, very different cultural narratives. Like virtually every facet that you can imagine is different. So maybe those differences would be represented in terms of functional brain differences. And using something like using Synchrony, we can also start setting up these cross-cultural comparisons of brain activity and kind of getting a better insight into who and what we are as humans and figuring out what things are fundamentally the same in terms of how we put our worlds together. And kind of looking to those as major come-together points. And then also being able to identify what are points that are deeply rooted within us that we may differ, but because we can recognize it, we can make progress. So I think the idea of Synchrony has the opportunity to affect cultural diplomacy in virtually every way you can imagine: economic, social, diplomatic. I'm happy about it.
Excellent.